Anatomía del Poder is honored to welcome Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the Labour Party, who has visited Bogota to participate in the emergency conference on Palestine. And before we talk specifically about this conference and its outcomes, could you tell us, Jeremy, about your long-standing personal and political commitment to defending human rights and promoting peace? Welcome.
I've been involved in peace and human rights activities all my life. The first organization I ever joined as a young person was in the 1960s when I joined the campaign for nuclear disarmament after the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was then only 13, 14, about 14, and I've been a member of that campaign ever since. I also became very involved in many human rights activities, partly because when I left school, I didn't go to university. I instead went as a volunteer to work in Jamaica, which was then a newly independent former British colony. And my job there was voluntary teaching in a secondary school, but also working with young people. And I then became much more aware of anti-colonial history, much more aware of the injustices around the world in a global sense. And I didn't go to university, but to me, the University of Life was something that taught me a great deal. And after I'd been in Jamaica, I had a fascinating few months traveling on my own around much of Latin America, in Brazil and Paraguay, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. And I learned a great deal from that. So my life has always been having a perspective of history from the position of the countries that achieved independence from empire. And the one thing I learned a great deal of in Jamaica, because I'd been to a very traditional English secondary school, was about the history of the Black consciousness movement, about the then called Black Power movement, and the workings and writings of Dr. Walter Rodney at that time. So that was my education, and I've always been fascinated by the countervailing forces in history. And so one of the books that has influenced me a great deal has been The Open Veins of Latin America, because it says so much about the inversion of history by the way in which it's taught in Western Europe. And so political decisions and political attitudes often come from either an understanding or a misunderstanding of history. So that's where I come from on it. And I became a member of Parliament in 1983 and have been involved in the Human Rights Group in the British Parliament. I was for 5 years a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which monitors the European Court of Human Rights, as well as elects judges to the European Court of Human Rights. And so I have that perspective, and I've been involved in many campaigns for peace and justice around the world. I've had the opportunity, and it is a great privilege, of visiting pretty much every country in Latin America, oddly enough, with the exception of Ecuador, Venezuela, and Panama. I don't know why I haven't been to those three, but no doubt I will visit at some point. And I've been in Colombia on 3 different occasions, once as a trade union delegation some years ago. And then I was there as an election monitor for the last presidential election. And I was there for the wonderful event hosted by the Colombian government of the Hague process on observing the need for justice for the Palestinian people. And if I may say so, that is the cause of our time. If we as a global force can stand together and support the Palestinian people and ensure they're able to live in peace, in justice in their own country, we will have done the right thing. But it's going to be hard. And my heart bleeds for the way in which the Palestinian people are being treated in Gaza at the present time.
Yeah, I would like to ask you about that conference. What was the purpose of the conference on Palestine in Bogota, and how did it go, and what were the results?
The purpose and thinking behind it was this. South Africa made the very brave decision to make an application to the International Court of Justice on a case of genocide, a charge of genocide against the government of Israel. It was a very brave thing for South Africa to do. I'm a member of the cabinet of Progressive International, which is an organization of progressive parties, unions, and community organizations around the world. And we were constantly worried that South Africa was in danger of being isolated. And so through Progressive International, we then decided to set up the Hague group. And indeed, our inaugural meeting was in the Hague, where either ministers or ambassadors from a number of countries came together, including Colombia, South Africa, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Cuba, and a number of other Caribbean and Latin American nations. At that time, nobody in Europe was involved in it. We set up the Hague group, and our purpose is to work as a group, a bloc, if you will, in the UN to support the ICJ and ICC judgments. And it's very important to keep restating that support for international law, which is very much on the side of the Palestinian people. The government of Colombia then offered to host a coming together, a physical conference of all of the states involved. And I want to say a big thank you to the government of Colombia for doing that. So we had the conference and agreed on the statement at the end of it. I was there as a member of PI and obviously observed a lot of what was going on. And what came out of it was this sense of unity, that we've got this block of nations, but we've also got, apart from the ones who actually signed the declaration, we've got a large number of others, 18 others, who were represented at the events in Bogota and are now consulting back home on whether they will sign the declaration altogether. And I think a number of them will. So we're looking here at cooperation from Ireland, from Norway, from Spain. We're looking also at Brazil. We're looking also at Chile. We're looking at a number of countries around the world because it is important that the narrative be maintained. Israel has been found to be in breach of the Genocide Convention, in breach of the Geneva Conventions on the powers and rights of occupying powers in respect of the West Bank, has two ICC, International Criminal Court, rulings against two of its leading politicians. And the whole world can see day in, day out what's happening. Now, this is where it goes further. The supply of weapons to Israel, knowing full well that they are acting in breach of ICJ recommendations and ICC decisions, constitutes of itself a crime. And so those nations, Britain included, that supply weapons to Israel, knowing that acts of genocide have been committed, makes them culpable as well. And so we want to push that argument all around the world, and we're doing that very successfully. And more people are joining in the global movement in support of Palestine. And in the case of Britain, I think Britain has been acting in an appalling way by continuing to supply arms and also overflying Gaza with Royal Air Force planes, which have been taking lots of photos and information, which we think could be supplied to Israel to assist their bombing campaigns. And I then proposed a bill, a private member's legislation in the British Parliament, to set up an inquiry into British policy in relation to Gaza. The bill passed its first stage in Parliament, but was blocked after that by the government. And so what we've done through our project, the Peace and Justice Project, which is very much affiliated to Progressive International, is to organise a 2-day hearing, a public inquiry, if you will, into British policy in Gaza at a big building called Church House in Westminster, which is a place which is very near to the Houses of Parliament, and that will be held on the 4th and 5th of September. And so that isn't of itself going to change policy, but it will give a hearing and an airing to the issues that we are deeply concerned about. Why is the world incapable of stopping Israel from bombing children and starving children to death? And those children are dying in sight of water, food, medicine, and safety. It's abominable.
Thank you, Mr. Jeremy. In Colombia, President Gustavo Petro, as you said, has declared his will to stop coal exports to Israel. However, companies like Drummond from the United States and Glencore from Switzerland rely on existing contracts and legal frameworks that have not fully suspended their sales. From your perspective, what should happen in cases like this? Not only in Colombia, but also in other countries that made commitments during the Bogota Emergency Conference on Palestine, and how can those pledges be translated into concrete action despite economic or legal obstacles?
That is a very important and very strong point. I was just in a discussion with some colleagues at Middle East Eye, which is a news organization based in Britain that does a lot of reporting on the Middle East, about the double standards that are applied, in the sense that you have national governments making very good decisions and very good positions in relation to Palestine, but at the same time hosting companies within their own jurisdiction which are selling stuff to Israel, not necessarily arms, but selling other things to sustain Israel economically. And our campaign has to be to expose that. Our template, I suppose, for this has got to be the way in which the world united eventually against the apartheid regime in South Africa and called for sanctions, universal sanctions against South Africa, which eventually was an important factor in the end of the apartheid regime. It wasn't the only factor. The main factor was the uprising of the South African people, but it was a factor. We want the same factors to apply now. And so companies that engage need to be boycotted and their governments need to act accordingly. And so I've just been yesterday sending a video message to a BDS conference, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Against Israel conference, which is being organized in Palestine to promote this, because we are faced with a situation where the world is looking in two directions. On the one hand, many governments make very good statements in support of the Palestinian people, and that's right, that's helpful, that's good. But if they're at the same time allowing Elbit Systems, who are an Israeli company manufacturing parts for F-35 jets by other companies, and then occasioning a supply of those parts to the USA where they come back as a finished plane, then they are complicit. So the British government's supply of weapons to Israel is in part the direct supply, which the government now says it's suspending. I'm skeptical about that. But it's also 15% of the components of the F-35 jets are made in Britain. Those planes couldn't fly without British complicity. It's got to stop.
Mr. Corbyn, thank you for your answer. Your visit provides us a tremendous opportunity to ask you two questions that are the subject of constant debate. The first concerns the accusation of antisemitism leveled at those who criticize the Israel government. Bernie Sanders in the United States, Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, and if I recall my mind correctly, today was the president of France, also Emmanuel Macron, and you in the United Kingdom have all been asked to explain your position on anti-Semitism. What do you think of this insistence? It's just a tactic to avoid focusing on the atrocities that we are witnessing in Gaza and in the occupied territories, or is there a real debate?
First of all, let's be very, very clear. Anti-Semitism is wrong. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism against Jewish people. It is completely wrong and unacceptable in any circumstances. I've always made that clear all of my life. It is perfectly possible to discuss the issue of Israel's foreign policy, Israel's military activities, Israel's breach of international law, without in any way descending into anti-Semitic language or anti-Semitic processes. And indeed, all of the demonstrations we've held in London, all of them, every single one of them, have had a very large block of people in attendance on those marches called the Jewish Bloc. And they are people from the Jewish Socialist Group, from Jewish Voice for Labour, and from a number of other Jewish organizations. And they're all very, very clear what their positions are. So it's important that we say that. When in Britain, the Equality and Human Rights Commission produced a report which was critical of some of the processes in the Labour Party. By the way, processes that I changed and corrected because I recognised that there were deficiencies in those processes. I then said that many of the claims made were actually unfair, unreasonable, and that anti-Semitism was wrong under any circumstance. I made that very clear all along. And I was then accused, along with many others, of being anti-Semitic. And indeed, it is a lazy way of avoiding any serious debate about what is going on in Israel and the government of Israel and what it does. And so there are large numbers of Jewish people in Britain that have been accused of anti-Semitism as well. So it's got to some very strange levels of accusation and behavior here. Let's be clear. There are also many people in Israel who profoundly disagree with what the government of Israel is doing and actually strongly support the Palestinian people. They're not a majority, I know that, but they are a significant number of people. And the radical Jewish tradition all over the world has been one of supporting humanitarian, human rights and progressive causes. And I think we should recognize that. So it's never, ever descend into anti-Semitism in any form. Let's work together, all of us, to try and bring about justice for the Palestinian people, an end to the occupation and the total withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, the West Bank and the Jordan Valley.
The second question concerns the use of the term genocides in public debate. Should the decision of whether or not it is genocide be left to lawyers, historians, politicians, journalists, or ordinary people? As a reminder, while few people question the atrocity of Israel's intervention in Gaza, the question of genocidal intent is hotly debated. What is your position on this issue? Is there use or non-use of the term genocide key to the debate?
Genocide is when there is a collective attack against an individual group of people or a group of people because of their ethnicity, their language, their faith. And so when a group is identified for particular attack and in many cases extermination. So historic acts of genocide were the attacks on African people who were opposed to slavery and opposed to be loaded onto slave ships to be taken across the Atlantic. Genocide was the way in which the conquistadors behaved when they arrived in Central America and South America and what they did to the indigenous peoples that were there. Genocide was what the Nazis did against Jewish people, gays, and others in their endeavors in the 1930s and 1940s. Genocide was what happened in Rwanda. Genocide was what happened in Burundi. Genocide was what happened in Cambodia and in Darfur. So there is precedent and there is history on it. It is clearly written out as a legal point. I was at the ICJ when the question of genocide came up. And indeed, in the British Parliament, some people said you can never accuse the government of Israel of genocide because of what the victims of the Nazis suffered in the 1930s and 1940s. Well, they did suffer genocide. It was abominable. It's the greatest crime in history that happened, the way in which 6 million people were murdered in the gas chambers. But that does not mean you cannot discuss what the Israeli Defense Force is doing in Gaza. where it specifically singled out Palestinians, specifically sought to kill Palestinian civilians. 60,000 have already died. Now, the International Court of Justice is a very serious institution. It's not a pushover. They're very well qualified, very well informed lawyers who have the most deep and intense debate. To be there, I felt a privilege just to be in the same room, to be able to listen to the discussion going on before my eyes. They came to that decision that genocide has been committed against the Palestinian people by the Israeli Defense Force. So I think we should understand and accept that. It might be uncomfortable for some people to accept it, but we've got to accept it. So that means if we don't want to be complicit in genocide, we should not be providing arms and supplies to Israel, which can be used to further their occupation. And I'm now hearing this debate that's going on in Israel between whether or not they accept a ceasefire, which apparently Hamas have now agreed to, so the reports tell us, or they're going to call up an extra 50,000 Israeli soldiers from reserves to go in and completely take over Gaza City and expel 1 million Palestinians to live goodness knows where, somewhere around Rafah. The idea being to put so much pressure on the Palestinian people and the border crossing between Rafah and the Sinai that eventually the Palestinian people will be literally driven out of Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula. That's an act of genocide in itself. Genocide of preventing those people even remaining in their own homes. Let's be clear about it. Genocide is happening before our very eyes.
I would like to go back to this point that I didn't ask in the whole question, and this is related to antisemitism. Could you please enlighten us on the debate surrounding the definition of antisemitism? On the one hand, there is the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is often used to weaponize antisemitism in order to stifle free speech relating to criticism of Israel actions and policies. On the other hand, there is the definition of the Jerusalem Declaration on Antisemitism, which expressly draws distinctions between antisemitism and criticism of Israel.
The IHRA declaration, which has been, well, was quite widely supported, the examples, though, it do have problems and do have deficiencies in it because it does try to close down discussion about Israel and its behavior. I think that here we are now, 2025. It'd be much more appropriate to support the Jerusalem Declaration, which makes it very clear that anti-Semitism is absolutely wrong, but it is not anti-Semitic to discuss what Israel is doing in its acts of genocide against the Palestinian people. And I think we have to make that distinction very, very clear. If we're anti-racists, as we all are, I hope, then we're against any form of racism, whatever it is. Islamophobia, anti-black racism, anti-Semitism, or anything else. But it should never prevent us discussing issues such as the behavior of governments or armies in occupation anywhere in the world. It is not racist to criticize somebody because they are committing an act of genocide. It is racist to condemn them for being the faith they are, the language they are, the ethnic group they are. That is racist, of course.
On 24 July, you and Sarah Sultana launched a new left-wing political movement called Your Party, which advocates wealth redistribution, social housing, nationalization of key services, and ending arms sales to Israel. What is your position on the Israel-Palestine conflict? We clearly know what is your position, but do you believe the two-state solution is still viable, or does your party propose a different framework for justice and peace?
Well, the party has not been formally established yet. We've called for the establishment of it through yourparty.uk, and we've had 700,000 people express an interest in supporting it. And so obviously the policies it adopts are going to have to be developed. But we set out, in calling for this party to be set up, a general series of proposals. One was international peace and justice, including recognition of the Palestinian people and their rights and an end to arms sales. Secondly, equality and human rights in Britain, including economic justice. The levels of poverty and inequality in Britain are appalling at the present time, and we're now going through a new period of austerity, which is making it even worse. Thirdly, environmental sustainability around the world and in Britain itself. And so it is about the kind of society we want to create, the creative society, where the words I've often used are to create a society fit for the next generation. And that's what we're trying to do. Your question about the future configuration of Palestine and the Palestinian people, I'm always quite reluctant to start dictating to people who are under occupation as to what the long-term solution to their lives and issues should be. I'm in solidarity with the Palestinian people. They've asked us to promote the recognition of Palestine. That I've always done and supported that in the UK Parliament and would do so again. But it's up to the Palestinian people to tell us what kind of relationship they want in the future and what sort of society they want to create in the future. We are not living in Palestine. We are not Palestinian people. We're there in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Very important distinction. And so I'm not going to dictate what society should be created there. I'm going to say I'm in solidarity with the people of Palestine.
Germany recently suspended arms exports to Israel, citing concerns over Gaza. Do you see this as the first saying that a major Western power is recognizing Israel's action as genocide, or is it just as symbolic?
I think it's highly significant that Germany is now moving into a position of suspending arms and equipment sales to Israel, because Germany has been of the European countries, the one that has been most steadfast in its support for Israel at every single turn, and indeed been very keen on even preventing public meetings and demonstrations in support of Palestine in German cities. So it's been the most pro-Israel government, that is, of all the countries in Europe. So the fact that they're now moving into a position of saying no arms sales, I think is very significant. And the French government now saying it will recognize Palestine at some point, apparently next month, is important. The British government's position has been the weakest and worst in Europe for a very long time. But even they have now said they will recognize Palestine, although they seem to give Israel some way out of it by saying unless they agree to a ceasefire. Well, I don't think the question of the ceasefire otherwise ought to decide it. If you're in favor of recognizing Palestine, you recognize Palestine. You don't put conditions on it, you just do it. And that is what I put in the 2019 manifesto, which I obviously helped to write when we fought the general election.
Mr. Corbyn, what is your prediction for the short-term cessation of atrocities in Gaza? To what extent can the international community influence the end of this outbreak of violence in the short term?
The news that apparently Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire proposal, which came partly from Steve Winchkoff and others, that was put together, which involves, as I understand it, the release of most, if not all, of the remaining hostages and returning of the remains of those that have sadly died whilst they've been in Gaza. In return, that would be a ceasefire. But I would have thought that has to be accompanied by Israel saying it will no longer continue with the the military bombardment of Gaza, which it's now proposing to do. I think there are cautious hopes that there will be a ceasefire in the very near future. And whilst they're not connected directly, the mood about the likelihood of a ceasefire or some kind of peace process between Ukraine and Russia does change the mood quite a lot. And it looks a bit odd if President Trump and others are keen to promote a ceasefire in Ukraine, but not prepared to do the same in Gaza. The issues of occupation apply in both conflicts.
When you look at Gaza today, the destroyed schools, the children dying of hunger, the mothers burying their children, and the journalists targeted and killed, and the silence of many governments, do you ever feel that humanity somehow has failed? And if so, what keeps you fighting when despair could be the easier path?
It's been my honor and privilege to visit Gaza on 9 different occasions in my life. I've met people with amazing resilience and strength who've suffered so much and carry on. And I've been in schools where the children were full of wonderful, bright ideas. I remember one school with children reading their poetry to me and showing me their artwork. And I've had some wonderful experiences in Gaza. Yet at the same time, you always had this feeling you're in a big prison, that a super educated population, the highest number of graduates anywhere in the world is in Gaza. Yet you can't travel, high levels of unemployment, high levels of underemployment, and a lot of reliance on UNRWA, UN Relief and Works Agency, for food, for education, and for health. And so I find it devastating what has happened. And the people of Gaza don't deserve this. Those children, tiny babies being starved to death, children in primary school being killed by bombs dropped from high in the sky with no risk whatsoever to the pilot that's dropping those bombs, and some of them guided by artificial intelligence. So we have sort of grotesque example of 21st century technology spending billions and billions of dollars on it to do what? Destroy schools, destroy homes, destroy hospitals. This is just unspeakably appalling. And when the history books are written of the 21st century, imagine in 100 years' time, people in universities in your country and mine are going to be saying, what was happening in the 2020s? What was happening that the world's politicians didn't just stand by and do nothing? They supplied the weapons which killed the children and the people of Gaza. The political leaders, most of them, of the current period are going to be condemned by history for their inaction, or worse, their actions in supplying the weapons that have brought about this devastation.
Finally, what do you think we as citizens of Colombia should commit ourselves to defending the Palestinian people who are resisting 15 kilometers away from us, and what we can do in practical terms?
Colombia has a history, a wonderful history of fighting back against colonial powers. Indeed, Simón Bolívar, who led the liberation of Latin America from the Spanish Empire, plotted his course at a building in central London near Warren Street, what is now Warren Street Station. And every time I pass the house where Simón Bolívar lived, I always think, yeah, this shows that things can change with determination by people. And so I hope that the people of Colombia will recognize that your government hosting the Hague Convention was a very important step forward. And history will say, well, the Hague Convention met in Bogota, and it made that declaration to try to inspire other nations to use their membership of the UN to support the Palestinian people. So, public declarations of support, demonstrations, meetings, music, fundraising events are all very important. Sometimes I feel I'm not doing enough. I come home from a demonstration in central London, I feel I'm not doing enough. And then I get a call from somebody in Gaza or somebody in the West Bank who just says, thank you for being on the demonstration. Thank you for showing support. It gives us hope and gives us courage. And also check out those companies that are supplying equipment to Israel, some of which might end up in the arms industry. Some of that equipment might end up bombing places in Gaza. And make sure you demonstrate against that, and make sure you force your government and your parliament to stop that supply as well. Citizens of the world, us as people, globally, have risen up in support of the Palestinian people. And we're not going down until the Palestinian people are able to live in their peace and their freedom. I'm inspired by the poetry written by Palestinian people. I'm inspired by the music and by the art of them and their spirit of surviving this abominable bombardment. Do you know there's more bombs been dropped on Gaza already since the October 23 than were dropped in the whole of the Iraq war? Doesn't that say something about a very small area of land that has been so comprehensively bombed and destroyed? The mental health consequences of this are intergenerational. There's going to be people with survivor's guilt at the end of this conflict. We've got to support them for the long haul. And you know what? We will.
Mr. Corbyn, I would like to tell you something. Back in 2015, as a journalist, I was in Palestine, and I record a documentary, and then somehow I was a witness of the people of Palestine living under military control because the Israel armed force control everything. And I'm really sorry for insist, but how is humanity composed after this? I mean, we broke a pact, like after the Second War, we say like we won't kill each other again.
Bibiana, you're so right in what you say. After the First World War, they said it was a war to end all wars, never again. And various conventions were signed, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the League of Nations, and so on. And then only 20 years later, the Second World War broke out. The end of the Second World War, they said, never again. And the United Nations was set up. And the various other conventions on international law were established, including the ICJ, which had been set up before under the League of Nations, was developed. And they said, never again. I've just come back from Japan, where I was for 2 weeks. I went to the 80th commemoration of the nuclear weapons used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which in one day killed 200,000 people. And then over the next few years, more than 1.5 million died as a result of either nuclear weapons or nuclear testing. And all of them said, never again. So we got the Non-Proliferation Treaty, now being breached by every one of the major powers. It is a question of how we as citizens around the world react, how we as organizations react, and how we force our governments. We have a choice before us. Is the world going to continue spending nearly $3 trillion a year on weapons and war? Or are we going to reduce that and spend more on dealing with inequality, environmental sustainability, making sure every child has health care, has education, and has a future? I know which I want. I know which most people around the world want. And I just think we need to get ourselves out of the mindset that you only ever bring about security by the ability to kill other people. Real security is what? Food, water, home, education, healthcare, housing. That's what real security is. Let's make sure we get real security for the entire population of the world. And while we're doing it, stop destroying the planet through environmental destruction, but develop environmental sustainability. None of these things are easy. No, because you're standing up against very rich and very powerful people. None of these things are ever easy. But that's why we've got to do them.
Jeremy Corbyn, we really appreciate your taking time off your busy schedule to come to Anatomía del Poder and give our listeners the lowdown on what's been going on in this conflict. Many thanks, and also I would say that people like me and maybe my generation will remember you forever. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bibiana. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this afternoon. I look forward to seeing you again in Colombia.
Hopefully. Thank you so much.
Hasta luego y muchísimas gracias por todos.
Muchas gracias. We have decided to shut down Anatomía del Poder on Spotify. History will remember whether we choose to remain silent or to stand on the side of humanity, and we choose humanity. Un agradecimiento especial en la colaboración y el desarrollo de este episodio a Escaleta Films, a Karen Buitrago, a Xavier Fargetón, Hernando Salazar y Jairo Arenas por la investigación y por la elaboración de este libreto y de esta entrevista. Nosotros tenemos una cita nuevamente el próximo jueves. Muchas gracias por seguirnos a través de nuestras redes sociales y no olviden compartir con sus familias y suscribirse en nuestro canal de YouTube.